Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a short story that I read because it is Short Story Tuesday. And I wanted to focus on a short story that is the story of Moses told from a different perspective. I am referring to The Last Israelite in the Dead Sea by Cooley Windsor, which comes from his collection of short stories, Visit Me in California, which was published in 2008. For those who don't know, Cooley Windsor is a lesser-known author from California. I say lesser-known because the only real information I could find about them was from their own website. So I don't know much else about them, and I've never heard of them before. And it turns out this book is the only thing that Cooley Windsor has published, at least that's reflected on their own website. They might have published some of their other short stories in other journals and magazines and whatnot, but I haven't heard of them. So Cooley Windsor apparently teaches at a California art school, so passing on their knowledge to other students, it would seem. Yeah, but I don't know much else about Cooley Windsor, which is sometimes the case on Short Story Tuesday, especially when you pick up a book from kind of randomly at your local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. So, yeah, without further ado, let's talk about The Last Israelite in the Dead Sea. I will do a brief summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Last Israelite in the Dead Sea focuses on an unnamed narrator in Egypt. They're an Israelite, as indicated by the story. I think they're also Jewish because they're hanging out with Moses. And the story is told from their perspective on what Moses is doing. So they're witnessing all these minor miracles and the plagues that are happening as Moses tells Egypt to let his people go. He sees what Moses is doing and sort of pretends to do the same thing in the forest and jumps out of a tree every now and then. And one time he accidentally falls on Moses and kind of terrifies Moses a little bit. So Moses is a little wary of this person. But the person is still faithful because they see what Moses is doing and they believe in the power of God, and they want to be seen as a faithful person who is worthy of God's love and God's creations. But again, he keeps coming across Moses in the story. One time even throwing a rock at a bush because he believes it's a demon or some kind of creature that wants to harm Moses. But it turns out it's just Moses peeing behind the bush, and that just creates a little bit of trouble for their relationship, I want to say, even though there's not much of a relationship going on. But as in the story of Moses, the leaders of Egypt chase Moses and his company to the Red Sea, where everyone's like, oh, what do we do? And Moses parts the Red Sea, which everyone thinks is pretty neat, and they march basically through the Red Sea to the Promised Land. But the narrator accidentally falls into the water side of things because they're trying to place an octopus back into the water. Although the narrator can't swim, they're able to make it out, but they find themselves alone and again marveling the beauty of how God was able to let Moses do all of this. But as they're marveling at the beauty, they hear the sounds of hoof prints and horses and whatnot, and they look back and they see that Egypt is chasing them. So the end of the story is them racing to shore and hoping that as Moses sees them, Moses doesn't decide to just let this person suffer because of their perceived vendetta for all the inadvertently harmful things that have happened to Moses. But Moses allows this person to reach the shore, and they proclaim safety as the story comes to an end, and we're left to assume that the Egyptians were swallowed by the Red Sea. So in terms of analysis, one element of the story that I like is how Windsor is able to balance humor and faith in this story. So there's jokes, there's comedic elements, because this is the story of Moses told from another perspective that made me laugh a little bit. But it's also paired with elements that are faithful. So it's clear that Windsor is poking fun at this moment, but only so much. Without taking away of the hugeness of this moment in Jewish history. So there are some jokes, as I'll illustrate with this quote here. And Moses said, God shall this day get us honor upon Pharaoh. Now shut up. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters were caused to go back by a strong wind, and the sea divided, and even its waters separated as walls, that there might be the land for our feet, even of all the people of the nation, each one. Will you look at that, we all said. So we trudged into the air ditch that ran through the sea and started walking to the other side. And I like how the people kind of marvel at what Moses did in a sort of not so grand kind of way. They're like, oh, what are we going to do? And Moses parts the Red Sea, and they're all like, oh, well, we can, I guess that works too. And it's kind of a funny moment, because I guess that's how everyone would react to such, grand gestures happening. Oh, I guess that's how we're going to make our way. It's pretty funny for how miraculous it is. But at the same time, there's still a respect for God's power. The narrator is very, and the Jewish people who are following Moses are still pretty respectful of what is happening. They awe at the beauty of the parted sea when the time comes. And the narrator in particular is he views this as a grand, beautiful sort of gesture, realizing everything that's possible if you are one with God. And I think they're pretty tight with God at the beginning of the story, although they act very strangely. Throughout the story you hear of how much respect they have for God, that in particular that God has chosen the narrator in this story. And there's also an indication that the narrator might be obsessed with Moses, but only because of that relationship with God. If Moses approves of the narrator, I think the assumption is that must mean that God thereby approves of the narrator, which I think is kind of an interesting element of this story. Not so much obsessed with the prophetic figure, but through the connection that they share with God, and hoping that maybe one day you will walk alongside God in the kingdom of heaven, or maybe that's not exactly what the Jews believe, but I think it's a pretty interesting kind of element to this story. And another element of this story is the fact that it's not focused on Moses, but it still rightfully views Moses as important. As I noted before, the obsession with Moses in this story is more of recognizing their connection to God and marveling at that. There's an aura of holiness every time the narrator views Moses, and it makes the narrator kind of uncomfortable that they keep messing up their opportunity to connect with Moses on any level. So I don't know if that's the case for everyone who's following along with Moses. Maybe some of them aren't so much as believers in Moses as they like what he's promising them, which is, not being enslaved by the Egyptians, but a promised land of milk and honey, as the narrator says. So things, they might just be going along with Moses for the promise of a better tomorrow. But I think that's what would happen in the moment of the story. There'd be a lot of people who are very high on Moses. There might be a cult of personality around him because of what Moses represents, and the power of someone who does these miraculous things. You saw that with Jesus, how he had disciples, just people surrounding him and thinking, wow, this person is important, and they also seem to have some sort of connection with the higher being, and I want to feel that. I want to feel like there's a sense of purpose or something like that. So I do like how Cooley Windsor writes about Moses in this story. I don't know if Windsor is Jewish himself. That might be an element of the story. I couldn't find that information online, but the way it's written seems to come from someone who might be Jewish themselves. It's entirely likely that they're just really good at writing this relationship. But I think that in order to, be able to talk about this sort of thing in a way that Windsor is talking about, there has to be some sort of connection with the Jewish faith. So I don't know what that is, but it's an element worth exploring further as it pertains to, being able to write something like this. And so those are my thoughts on The Last Israelite and the Dead Sea by Cooley Windsor. I did read some of the other stories in this collection that were pretty interesting. There's an unusual style where he writes on a theme and then breaks it up into much shorter stories. There's a particular story about emergency preparedness, where he talks about the preparing for earthquakes, not only in terms of what comes during the earthquake, but what happens afterwards and how your life is kind of ruined and you just have to persist. And that's what emergency preparedness would really mean. And I think you'll have to read it for yourself, because I'm not explaining it with the proper energy, I guess. But I do recommend reading this going out if you can find it, buying it perhaps. It's an interesting collection of stories. So I guess I would say I recommend it in the end. If you read this story before, or you want to simply comment on something I've said here, do so below. I would love to have a conversation with you about this short story. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this story, and also Cooley Windsor, who not a lot of information available about them, especially if this is the only thing they've ever published. I would like to see if they have anything more to say out there. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and biblical travels. Farewell.